Okay. In a minute, we'll flip the papers over and start filling in the backside of your notes. In fact, do that now. And notice that in addition to some definitions you'll write in the left-hand column just as you have been, there are a few extra notes that you'll need to take on the bottom of the page. Be ready for those as well. And let's move on now to the next one that you can probably guess already. Theme is the universal message about life revealed by the story, or the moral. The theme is really what you're supposed to take away or learn from the story. Maybe even not what you're supposed to. Maybe you get a different theme than the author intended, but the theme is your big takeaway, some sort of lesson that you can apply to other things outside the story. The theme is revealed in large part by what the conflict is and how it's resolved. Think for a minute about a story where two different students really wanted to win the spelling bee. And one student, in order to prepare, spent hours researching word histories, checking word lists, studying different languages, learning different roots, really doing every single thing they could to prepare. The other student didn't. But right before the spelling bee, that student snuck into the teacher's office and got the list of words and studied just those so that he had the upper hand. Now, the theme of the story is going to depend on which student wins, right? Because if the student who cheated wins the contest and doesn't suffer any negative consequences, then the lesson is that hard work doesn't always pay off, or that shortcuts work. However, if the student gets caught after cheating and the other student wins, then of course you have a very different theme, and it's that, you do need to work hard, that taking shortcuts will often wind up getting you in big trouble, etc. Another big reminder, sometimes people think themes can just be single words. They'll say the theme of the story is love or family. That's not a theme yet. It can be a subject for a theme, but a theme needs to be a complete idea. What does a story say about love or about family? That love is worth sacrificing for, that love is difficult to get, that the love you get from family is always more important than the love you get from friends. There are a lot of different points somebody can make about those big topics. So when you state themes, try to state them as complete ideas. Setting is the next literary term. It's definitely review. I know everybody remembers that setting is place in which a story takes place. Don't forget that it's also the time, that whether a story happens 300 years ago or in modern day or 300 years in the future has a big bearing on the events of that story. Setting also helps create the mood or feeling. It can even be specific to the conflict. If you know that the setting is another planet, you have a hint right away to the genre, that it's a science fiction story, and those kinds of conflicts and themes among science fiction stories tend to be similar, so you have some extra information just based on the time and place in which a story occurs. Characterization is a big name for how the author communicates information about the characters in the story. Characterization is how the author creates a vivid picture of the people they've made up. We talk about characterization in two main ways. First is direct. Direct characterization is when an author says simply that a character is something. For example, Lucy was sad, or Jenny was embarrassed. That's direct characterization because the author is just making it super clear. You don't have to do any thinking or figuring out. It's just said very directly. Indirect characterization is instead when an author merely suggests details about a character based on their actions, dialogue, appearance, or thoughts. So the author doesn't say Jenny was tired or Lucy was sad. Instead, they show it. And you might have heard a rule before from teachers called show, don't tell. Showing is more of indirect characterization. Telling is more direct. Good authors will use a combination of both. There are times that direct is still very effective, but usually good writers rely more heavily on indirect characterization. And with indirect characterization, there's a nice little mnemonic device to help you remember what kinds of things to consider for indirect characterization. And the mnemonic device is STEAL, S-T-E-A-L. And it stands for what a character says, what a character thinks, the character's effect on others, the character's actions, and how the character looks. So you can see the S-T-E-A-L there. So again, instead of saying Jenny was tired, an author using indirect characterization might say, Jenny entered the room slowly. Her eyes were focused on the floor, her feet shuffled, her shoulders drooped, and when she plodded to her desk, she sat down, let out a loud sigh, put her head down on her desk, and began to moan. You might know at that point, something's going on with Jenny, even though the author didn't say she was in a bad mood or she was tired. That's indirect characterization. Point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. And the two main types of point of view you need to worry about right now are first person and third person. With a first person point of view, the narrator is a character in the story who uses I to recount events. So the voice of the story says, I went to school, or I went to the Bahamas, or I boarded the spaceship. In a third person point of view, the narrator is a person outside the story who's not involved in the action and instead reports about different characters, he and she, and uses their names, but never interacts with the characters themselves. These days there is a trend. I think first-person narrators are increasingly common in young adult fiction. And again, sometimes you even see books where they have more than one first-person narrator. Again, in R.J. Palaccio's Wonder, different characters narrate different chapters of the story. They all say I, but they're speaking in their own voices about their own experiences in the book and their own chapters. The two final definitions you need today are foreshadowing, which is probably one you know. It is when an author hints about events to come later in a story. Sometimes these things happen sort of obviously when a character warns somebody that something else might happen, or if you have a character who has their fortune told or a prophecy shared with them. Sometimes it's a little bit more subtle. Sometimes it's when there's a reference to something you haven't heard before that comes up again later or signals some trouble that is vague or kind of general, and then you realize later as it becomes more specific what it was a reference to. And then the last term you need to fill in today is allusion. And an allusion is when an author refers to a famous person or event, a work of art, or even another story in their own story. So if somebody wrote a poem and said he was as masterful as Michael Jordan, that would be an allusion. And allusions are usually used to draw some sort of connections or parallels between your subject and this other famous thing or person. There are some good examples across literature, and one of the reasons sometimes we want to study classic books is that they are alluded to so many times, even in modern fiction. Those are all the definitions for today. We will come back to these, so if you have any questions or anything was unclear, again, put a little question mark or a star next to it on your notes so you remember. And also remember that you can always go back and watch and listen to both of these videos again whenever you need a little crash course or reminder. See you in class.